Recovered helm recordings from the Argel Depression show figures advancing through thermal bloom and battlefield dust, with the mass and silhouette of legionaries, yet not moving with any pattern expected of disciplined assault infantry. Their stride length changed mid-charge, their outlines expanded without warning. Auspex returns failed to hold a stable body shape for more than a few seconds at a time. In post-battle analysis, fragments of Mark IV plate were found fused to exposed bone growth, clawed extremities, and organic tissue that no apothecarian record could classify as either baseline human mutation or known Xenos grafting. Testimony from survivors was no cleaner. Some described warriors whose armour seemed intact until the moment of impact. Others reported that the same attackers appeared to peel themselves open from within, as if a second life had been carried inside the first and had finally decided to emerge. The name later attached to these battlefield records was not an Imperial designation. It was a Colchizian one, preserved in traitor testimony and Legion tradition, the Gal Vorbak. Their origin does not begin at Istvan, even if that is where the wider Imperium first understood that something profoundly wrong had entered the Legion as Astartes. The true beginning lies earlier, in the long psychological collapse of the Word-Bearers after the destruction of Monarchia and the Emperor's public humiliation of Lorgar and his legion on Kur. That censure did not merely wound pride, it destabilized the central identity of an entire legion that had been built around devotion, ceremony, and the conviction that conquest without spiritual meaning was hollow. In the years after Monarchia, the Word-Bearers outwardly resumed their role in the Great Crusade, but internally they changed direction. Later, Imperial analysis described this period as one in which renewed crusading activity concealed rapid growth, doctrinal corruption, and the quiet elimination of internal dissent. It was during this same broad phase that the Word-Bearers' secret pilgrimage took shape, the journey that would eventually create the first Gal Vorbak. The formation from which the first Gal Vorbak emerged was not the entire Legion, but the Serrated Sun, a chapter of the Word-Bearers known for tactical drop assaults. Within that chapter, Argel Tal, captain of the 7th Assault Company, and later master of the Gal Vorbak, became central to the transformation. He was not an incidental bystander who happened to survive a cursed expedition. He was one of Lorgar's favoured sons, a native of Colchis, the youngest warrior to rise so far in the Serrated Sun, and a figure close enough to the Legion's inner circles to be placed at the centre of events after Monarchia. Sources consistently tie the creation of the first possessed Word-Bearers to the Serrated Sun and to Argel Tal's company during Lorgar's pilgrimage. That is important, because it means the Gal Vorbak were not an accident of random corruption. They were born from a selected body of warriors chosen to go where others would not. The pilgrimage itself was undertaken through the Eye of Terror, and this matters more than simple geography. The Eye was not treated by the Word-Bearers merely as a dangerous warp anomaly. It became, in effect, a proving ground and revelation chamber. Later Games Workshop background material states that the first Gal Vorbak formed from survivors of the Word-Bearers' first pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror, and that what exactly happened to those first few cannot be known with certainty. That ambiguity is not a gap in the lore so much as part of the horror. The sources are clear on the result but deliberately incomplete on the precise mechanics. Those who returned had taken the power of chaos into body and soul. They were no longer conventional Astartes suffering corruption in the ordinary sense. They had become host and partner, vessel and cohabitant, capable of seeming unchanged until battle called forth the thing sharing their flesh. Accounts tied to the first heretic identify the vessel associated with this crossing as the Orpheo's Lament, carrying Argel Tal's company into the Eye under the guidance of Ingethel. Secondary sources summarise that roughly 30 Word-Bearers of the Serrated Sun entered that region aboard the vessel, though later retellings differ in small details and should be treated cautiously. What remains stable across sources is the structure of the event. The Serrated Sun entered the Eye as Legionaries and returned fundamentally altered. The original Gal Vorbak were therefore not created by ritual in a temple, laboratory procedure, or battlefield infection. Their development came through exposure, ordeal, contact, and packed within the most spiritually polluted region known to Imperial history. In that sense, they were prototypes born from revelation, not mass-produced weapons. The word-bearers did not stumble into a tool they barely understood. Lorgar's circle went looking for a new truth, and the Serrated Sun paid the first full biological and metaphysical price for finding it. One of the most important distinctions in the lore is that the original Gal Vorbak was superior to later possessed Marines. This is repeated in the Lexicanum. Over time, Gal Vorbak became a broader title used for word-bearers possessed by the Warp, but those later examples were explicitly described as a lesser breed than the first brethren who sealed their pact in darkness. The earliest Gal Vorbak were the first of their kind, true unions of Space Marine and Demon in a single being. That phrasing matters because it frames them not as ordinary Chaos Space Marines with a parasite attached, but as a deeper synthesis. They could communicate with the entities that shared their existence. They could appear unaltered when necessary. Then, in battle, they could discard that false normality and become monsters in which armour, flesh, bone and warp power merged into one combat body. Argel Tal represents the clearest case study for how this development unfolded over time rather than all at once. Later records identify his demon counterpart as Raum, but the symbiosis did not immediately present in full public form. Around year 5 of the 31st millennium, 4 decades after the Eye Journey, signs of the demons within the Gal Vorbak began manifesting openly through seizures during the compliance of Callus. Argel Tal and his brothers would withdraw, endure the internal struggle, and re-emerge changed, yet still functional. This progression is useful because it shows the Gal Vorbak were not static creatures the moment they returned. Their development continued, the possession matured, the shared existence between legionary and demon deepened with time, stress, and repeated war. By the time of Istvan, the internal thing had a battlefield voice. In Argel Tal's case, Raum could speak, could influence, and could eventually share control in ways that transformed him into a far larger and more bestial form than even many transhuman warriors had ever witnessed. Their formal identity within the Legion also developed in stages. Before the wider rebellion became public, the transformed survivors of the Serrated Sun constituted an elite inner cadre under Lorgar's favour. Argel Tal was elevated as their captain, the Crimson Lord, and the group became associated with crimson armour before the rest of the Legion fully adopted that hue. This is another subtle but important piece of origin history. The Gal Vorbak were not merely monsters hidden in storage until war began. They were a chosen sign of the Word-Bearer's new direction, a visible embodiment of the doctrine Lorgar had embraced after rejecting the Imperial truth. Once the Word-Bearers revealed their treachery openly at Istvan, the red of the Gal Vorbak gradually spread across the Legion, symbolising how what began as an elite and secret corruption was becoming the defining character of the whole host. In other words, the Gal Vorbak were both a military asset and a theological proof of concept. The development of the Gal Vorbak is inseparable from the broader development of the Word-Bearers themselves. The Legion had always been unusual among the Astartes because military command and spiritual authority were deeply intertwined. The Black Book extract emphasises how chaplains and commanders often blurred roles, with the reasons for war treated as no less important than victory. That organisational culture helps explain why the Gal Vorbak emerged from the Word-Bearers and not from a more conventionally martial legion. The Word-Bearers had already conditioned themselves to see war as doctrine made physical. Once Lorgar accepted the reality of the Chaos Gods, the step from preacher-soldier to possessed sacrament was grimly coherent. The Gal Vorbak were not an aberration from Word-Bearer culture. They were its most extreme fulfillment. They made visible the Legion's new creed by carrying divine corruption inside the Emperor's gene-forged body. Few things in the heresy better illustrate how thoroughly the 17th Legion had inverted its original purpose. There is also a tragic dimension to their origin that keeps the Gal Vorbak from reading as simple monsters. In Argel Tal's story especially, the early possessed were not presented as cackling caricatures who instantly welcomed damnation without residue of conscience. Their transformation was bound up with loyalty to Lorgar, the search for spiritual certainty, and a slow surrender to a truth they had been taught first to deny and then to embrace. That does not redeem them. It does, however, explain why the earliest Gal Vorbak carry more narrative weight than later possessed units in the setting. They were the first generation to cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. They discovered, in the worst possible way, that an Astartes could survive being shared. The cost was not only physical corruption, it was the death of any stable boundary between self, mission, belief, and hunger. By the time Imperial observers encountered them in full war form, the process was already complete enough that battlefield witnesses could only describe them as impossible. So the founding of the Gal Vorbak can be stated plainly. They began as selected warriors of the Serrated Sun Chapter of the Wordbearers, led by Argel Tal, sent on Lorgar's hidden pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror after the humiliation at Monarchia. The survivors returned fused with demonic entities, able to pass as legionaries until battle drew out the thing within. They became the first possessed Astartes of their kind, the original and most potent form of what later generations would imitate less perfectly. Their development continued across years as the symbiosis matured, their role hardened, and their existence became central to the Wordbearers' betrayal. When the galaxy later saw them on the black soil of Istvan, it was not witnessing the birth of the Gal Vorbak. It was witnessing the public debut of a secret that had already spent decades growing teeth. The Gal Vorbak cannot be understood through the same framework used to describe conventional legionaries, even those already considered corrupted or unstable. Their defining trait is not simply possession, but the nature of that possession as a sustained and functional union between Astartes' physiology and a warp entity. Where later possessed warriors often display erratic mutation, loss of coherence, or rapid degeneration, the original Gal Vorbak retained a disturbing degree of control. They could remain outwardly indistinguishable from standard wordbearers for extended periods. Their voices, posture, and operational discipline could pass inspection. The divergence revealed itself only under stress, command intent, or the initiation of combat. When transformation occurred, it was not a gradual mutation, but an abrupt and total reconfiguration of form. Armour plating split along unnatural seams, not as damage but as a deliberate unfolding. Ceramite fractured outward while remaining partially fused to newly grown bone structures. Limbs extended beyond Astartes' proportions, often ending in taloned extremities capable of tearing through reinforced plating. Secondary growths emerged from beneath armour layers that had not been designed to accommodate them, suggesting that the internal biological changes did not merely reshape the Marine, but actively displaced and rewrote the spatial relationship between flesh and wargear. Observers frequently reported that the Gal Vorbak appeared larger than their original mass should allow, an effect attributed to warp distortion rather than physical expansion alone. The head and facial region showed some of the most pronounced alterations. In many documented cases, the helmet was either forced apart or rendered functionally irrelevant as cranial structure changed. Jawlines extended, teeth multiplied or sharpened, and ocular regions emitted low luminosity consistent with warp energy leakage. In Argel Tal's case, the transformation into his full battle form resulted in a creature far exceeding the size and silhouette of a standard legionary, with wings and a hunched, predatory posture that bore only partial resemblance to his former self. This level of transformation was not universal among all Gal Vorbak, but it illustrates the upper threshold of what the symbiosis could achieve when fully expressed. Internally, the most critical distinction lies in the presence of the daemon as an active participant rather than a passive corruption. The Gal Vorbak did not simply house warp entities, they coexisted with them. This coexistence allowed for communication, negotiation, and at times conflict within the same body. Records indicate that Argel Tal could converse with Raum, the entity bound to him, with each influencing the other's decisions. This relationship created a layered consciousness in which instinct, doctrine, and warp impulse could merge or compete depending on circumstance. The result was a warrior capable of both calculated military action and sudden, overwhelming brutality driven by non-human intent. This duality granted the Gal Vorbak a level of adaptability that standard Astartes doctrine did not account for. They could maintain formation discipline when required, executing coordinated assaults with the precision expected of a Legion unit. Yet they could also abandon structure entirely, transitioning into chaotic close-quarters combat where their physical advantages and regenerative capabilities could be maximized. This ability to shift between order and disorder made them particularly difficult to counter. Opponents trained to anticipate Astartes' tactics found themselves facing entities that could follow doctrine until the exact moment it became advantageous to break it. Their war gear reflected both their origins as word-bearers and the changes imposed by their transformation. Standard Mark IV power armour remained the base configuration, often modified or reinforced to accommodate structural stress. However, over time, the distinction between armour and body became less reliable. In many cases, armour components fused directly with organic tissue, creating hybrid surfaces that could not be removed without lethal consequence. This fusion did not necessarily reduce effectiveness. Instead, it created a form of integrated protection where damage to armour could be partially mitigated by the resilience of the underlying mutated flesh, and vice versa. Weapon loadouts among the Gal Vorbak generally began with conventional Astartes armaments. Bolt pistols, chainswords, and combat blades were common, particularly during the early stages following their return from the Eye of Terror. However, as their transformation stabilized, reliance on external weaponry decreased. Their own bodies became primary instruments of war. Claws capable of puncturing power armor, enhanced musculature allowing for extreme force application, and the presence of warp-infused strength reduced the necessity of maintaining strict adherence to standard weapon doctrine. This shift did not eliminate the use of weapons entirely. Instead, it recontextualized them. Bolt weapons could still be employed during approach phases, softening targets or suppressing enemy positions before closing to melee range. Chainswords and power blades remained effective tools, particularly against heavily armoured opponents or mechanized infantry. Yet once engaged, the Gal Vorbak often abandoned these implements in favour of direct physical assault. Their regenerative capacity allowed them to absorb damage that would cripple a standard legionary, enabling them to remain in combat long enough to inflict catastrophic losses at close range. Another notable aspect of their equipment was the symbolic and ritualistic modification of armour and weapons. As word-bearers, the Gal Vorbak retained the Legion's emphasis on scripture, iconography, and devotional markings. Armour surfaces were inscribed with Colchizian runes, demonic sigils, and texts reflecting their allegiance to the powers they had embraced. These markings were not purely decorative. In many cases, they served as focal points for warp energy, reinforcing the connection between the Marine and the entity within. The presence of these inscriptions further blurred the line between war gear and ritual object, turning each Gal Vorbak into both a warrior and a walking testament to the Legion's new faith. Their tactical doctrine cannot be separated from these physical and metaphysical traits. Unlike standard Astartes units, which rely heavily on coordinated maneuvers, disciplined formations, and clearly defined roles, the Gal Vorbak operated with a hybrid approach. At the outset of an engagement, they could integrate seamlessly with broader word-bearer forces, participating in drop assaults, coordinated advances, and strategic positioning. This allowed them to deploy without immediately revealing their true nature, preserving the element of surprise. The transition point in their doctrine typically occurred at the moment of close engagement. Once within effective range, the Gal Vorbak would initiate transformation, abandoning conventional formation structures in favour of aggressive, high-impact assault. Their objective shifted from positional control to rapid disruption. Enemy lines were broken not through sustained firepower but through shock, terror, and the physical destruction of key units. Command elements, heavy weapon teams, and armoured assets became priority targets, as the Gal Vorbak's mobility and resilience allowed them to penetrate defensive layers that would slow or halt standard infantry. This approach created a cascading effect on enemy cohesion. Units accustomed to fighting Astartes found their expectations invalidated. defensive lines designed to withstand bolter fire and measured advances were overwhelmed by entities capable of closing distance at extreme speed, absorbing return fire and engaging in melee with overwhelming force. Psychological impact played a significant role. The visual and auditory experience of facing a transforming Gal Vorbak, combined with the apparent violation of physical laws governing their bodies, often resulted in loss of morale and breakdown of command structures. Coordination among the Gal Vorbak themselves remained intact despite their apparent descent into chaos. While individual transformations could appear uncontrolled, evidence suggests that they retained an underlying awareness of allied positions and objectives. This allowed them to avoid interfering with each other's movements while maximizing pressure on enemy forces. In effect, they operated as a swarm of highly intelligent predators, each capable of independent action but collectively aligned toward a shared tactical goal. Their use in larger strategic operations reflects this role. The Gal Vorbak were not deployed as line infantry or held in reserve for prolonged engagements. They were used as shock units, inserted at critical moments to break stalemates, exploit weaknesses, or deliver decisive blows against high-value targets. Their presence could turn a controlled engagement into a rout within minutes. However, this same intensity limited their use in prolonged operations where sustained discipline and resource management were required. One of the most effective aspects of their doctrine was the concealment of their true nature until the moment of engagement. Unlike later Chaos forces that displayed overt corruption from the outset, the Gal Vorbak could approach under the guise of standard Legionaries. This allowed them to infiltrate battle lines, participate in joint operations, and position themselves advantageously before revealing their full capabilities. In the context of the Horus Heresy, where trust between legions had already begun to erode but had not yet fully collapsed, this ability provided a significant tactical advantage. The Gal Vorbak represent a convergence of physical transformation, spiritual corruption, and military adaptation. Their distinctive traits are not isolated features, but components of a unified system in which body, armour, and doctrine reinforce each other. Their weapons are extensions of this system, whether external tools or the mutated forms they inhabit. Their tactical approach reflects the same integration, combining the discipline of Astartes training with the unpredictability and raw power of warp entities. In examining their role within the Word-Bearers, it becomes clear that the Gal Vorbak were not an experimental offshoot or a temporary deviation. They were the intended direction of the Legion's evolution, following its rejection of the Imperial truth. Every aspect of their design, from their physical capabilities to their method of deployment, aligns with the Word-Bearers' shift from crusaders of compliance to instruments of a new, darker doctrine. Their effectiveness on the battlefield ensured that this transformation would not remain confined to a single chapter or company, but would instead influence the trajectory of the Legion as a whole. The Gal Vorbak cannot be reduced to simple descriptions of aggression or corruption when examining their personality. What defines them most clearly is the coexistence of two distinct consciousnesses within a single body, and the way that coexistence reshapes identity over time. Unlike later possessed warriors who often lose coherence or descend into uncontrollable madness, the original Gal Vorbak retained a functional sense of self, even as that self was no longer singular. They did not forget who they were as Word-Bearers. They carried that identity forward, but it was no longer uncontested. In early stages following their return from the Eye of Terror, many of the Gal Vorbak exhibited restraint, reflection, and a degree of internal conflict. Records tied to Argel Tal demonstrate that the presence of the daemon did not immediately erase loyalty, discipline, or the capacity for reasoning. Instead, it introduced a second voice that could question, tempt, and influence. This created a form of layered personality in which decisions were not always made by a unified will. At times, the legionary personality dominated, maintaining control over action and purpose. At other times, the daemon asserted itself, pushing toward violence, predation, or outcomes aligned with warp instinct rather than strategic necessity. This dynamic did not remain static. Over time, the boundary between the two entities became less defined. The relationship evolved from conflict into a form of cooperation, though not one that could be described as harmonious in human terms. The Gal Vorbak learned to use the presence within them as a source of strength, rather than treating it solely as a threat. The daemon, in turn, gained a stable vessel through which it could act in the material world. The result was not a compromise in which both sides remained unchanged, but a transformation in which both were altered by the union. The Astartes became more aggressive, more willing to embrace destruction as a tool. The daemon became more focused, capable of channeling its instincts through a disciplined framework shaped by Legion training. This merging of perspectives produced a personality profile that was highly dangerous precisely because it retained clarity. The Gal Vorbak were not mindless berserkers. They could assess situations, recognize priorities, and execute complex objectives. Yet beneath that capability was an ever-present drive toward violence that did not require justification. In conventional Astartes, aggression is directed and controlled, serving a defined purpose within a larger operational plan. In the Gal Vorbak, aggression existed as both a tool and an inherent state. It did not need to be activated. It was always present, waiting for opportunity. Despite this, they were not uniformly unstable. Some retained a degree of introspection, particularly those closest to Lorgar's inner circle. Argel Tal again serves as the clearest example. His continued loyalty, his capacity for reflection, and his awareness of what he had become indicate that the Gal Vorbak were capable of understanding their condition without rejecting it. This awareness did not lead to reversal or resistance. Instead, it reinforced their commitment. Having crossed a threshold that could not be undone, they embraced their new state as both necessity and truth. Within the structure of the Wordbearers' Legion, the Gal Vorbak occupied a position that was both elite and symbolic. They were not integrated as standard line units, nor were they treated as expendable shock troops in the early stages of their existence. They were elevated. Their transformation was seen as proof of Lorgar's revelations, a tangible manifestation of the powers the Legion had chosen to follow. This granted them a status that extended beyond battlefield utility. They became exemplars of the Legion's new doctrine, living evidence that the path Lorgar had taken was not only viable but powerful. Organisationally, they remained tied to the Serrated Sun and to Argel Tal's command, at least in their initial formation. This preserved a level of cohesion that distinguished them from later possessed units, which were often more loosely organised. Their chain of command was clear. Their loyalty to Lorgar was absolute. This combination of structure and devotion allowed them to function effectively within larger Legion operations without becoming isolated or uncontrollable. As the Horus Heresy progressed and the Wordbearers' corruption spread, the role of the Gal Vorbak began to shift. Their unique status as the first possessed Astartes was gradually diluted as other Wordbearers underwent similar transformations. However, the distinction between the original Gal Vorbak and these later creations remained significant. The first generation retained a level of stability, power, and integration that subsequent possessed Marines struggled to replicate. This preserved their elite status even as the concept of possession became more widespread within the Legion. Their alignment within the broader Chaos hierarchy is also notable. Unlike forces that devoted themselves to a single Chaos god, the Gal Vorbak, as extensions of the Wordbearers, operated within a framework that acknowledged Chaos Undivided. This meant that their demonic counterparts were not necessarily tied to one aspect of the warp but could represent a broader range of entities. This lack of singular alignment contributed to their adaptability. They were not constrained by the expectations or limitations associated with devotion to a specific power. Instead, they embodied the Wordbearers' overarching philosophy of embracing chaos as a unified force. This philosophical alignment reinforced their role within the Legion. The Wordbearers did not view the Gal Vorbak as aberrations to be controlled or hidden. They were integrated into the Legion's identity, their existence woven into its rituals, doctrines, and long-term objectives. Chaplains and Dark Apostles, already central to the Legion structure, found in the Gal Vorbak a new form of authority. The presence of a daemon within a legionary was not seen as a loss of purity, but as an elevation, a closer connection to the divine forces the legion now served. The conclusion of their role within Chapter 1 must return to the broader significance of their existence. The Gal Vorbak represent a turning point not only for the word-bearers, but for the entire trajectory of the Horus Heresy. They demonstrate that the boundaries between Astartes and Warp entity can be broken in a controlled and repeatable manner, at least under specific conditions. This discovery alters the nature of warfare in the setting. It introduces a new category of combatant, one that combines the engineered perfection of the Emperor's design with the unpredictable and often overwhelming power of the warp. Their creation also illustrates the consequences of ideological transformation. The word-bearers did not arrive at the Gal Vorbak through random corruption or external imposition. They chose this path. The pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror was an intentional act, driven by a desire to replace one belief system with another. The Gal Vorbak are the physical result of that decision, embodying both its power and its cost. They are stronger, more resilient, and more versatile than standard Astartes in many respects. At the same time, they are no longer singular beings. They exist in a state that blurs identity, purpose, and control. In a strictly military sense, the Gal Vorbak can be classified as highly effective shock units with capabilities that exceed those of conventional legionaries. In a broader context, they serve as a case study in the integration of warp entities into human hosts, demonstrating both the potential and the inherent instability of such unions. Their continued effectiveness during the early stages of the heresy ensured that their model would be replicated, though rarely with the same level of success. Ultimately, the Gal Vorbak are defined by duality. They are both legionary and daemon, disciplined and chaotic, controlled and instinct-driven. This duality is not a weakness but the core of their strength. It allows them to operate across boundaries that limit other forces, shifting between roles, tactics, and states of being as required. At the same time, it ensures that they can never return to what they once were. Their existence marks the moment when the word-bearers ceased to be a legion in the traditional sense and became something fundamentally different. The Gal Vorbak are not an anomaly within that transformation. They are its first complete expression. Surviving administratum data logs compiled in the decades following the opening stages of the Horus Heresy consistently describe the Gal Vorbak not as a discrete unit classification, but as a deviation that forced repeated re-evaluation of existing threat categories. Initial battlefield reports did not identify them as a separate force. They were recorded as anomalous word-bearer legionaries, exhibiting unstable biological signatures, irregular mass readings, and inconsistent engagement patterns. Only after repeated encounters did patterns begin to emerge, leading to their recognition as a distinct formation. Administratum observers noted that standard Astartes threat assessments failed to account for the Gal Vorbak's behaviour. Conventional engagement models assumed predictable responses based on known Legion doctrines. The Gal Vorbak did not conform. Early reports describe instances where formations of word-bearers advanced in discipline ranks, only for a subset of those forces to undergo rapid morphological change mid-engagement. This shift invalidated pre-calculated firing solutions and disrupted defensive timing. Units prepared to counter a controlled advance instead faced a sudden transition into high-speed, close-quarters assault by entities exhibiting both increased resilience and irregular movement patterns. Mechanicus Auspex recordings provided more precise, though equally troubling observations. Biological scans indicated that Gal Vorbak life signs did not stabilize into a single pattern. Instead, readings fluctuated between baseline Astartes metrics and unknown signatures that did not correspond to any catalogued human or Xenos physiology. In several cases, dual-layered readings were recorded, suggesting the presence of overlapping biological states occupying the same spatial volume. Attempts to isolate one signal from the other proved unsuccessful, leading to the conclusion that the two were not separate entities operating in tandem, but components of a unified system. Further analysis of recovered armour fragments reinforced this conclusion. Standard ceramite plating showed signs of internal stress consistent with expansion from within, yet fracture patterns did not match explosive failure or external impact. Instead, the material appeared to have been forced outward in controlled segments, as if responding to an internal transformation rather than resisting it. In some samples, organic tissue had fused directly to the inner surfaces of armour plates, forming a continuous interface between machine and flesh. Mechanicus Magii classified these findings as evidence of a hybridization process not governed by known bioengineering principles. From a strategic standpoint, Administratum analysts identified the Gal Vorbak as force multipliers rather than independent operational units. Their deployment was consistently linked to critical phases of engagement, particularly moments where enemy lines showed signs of resistance or cohesion. Rather than being committed at the outset of battle, they were often held in reserve or embedded within standard formations until conditions favoured their use. This pattern suggested a level of command awareness regarding their optimal application, indicating that the word-bearers did not view them as uncontrollable assets. Observations of engagement sequences revealed a recurring structure. Initial contact would proceed according to recognisable Astartes doctrine, with bolter fire, coordinated movement, and suppression of enemy positions. During this phase, the presence of Gal Vorbak within the formation was not immediately apparent. At a calculated point, typically when opposing forces committed to defensive positions or began counter-offensive manoeuvres, the Gal Vorbak would initiate transformation and advance rapidly. This created a temporal disruption in the battle, collapsing the distinction between ranged engagement and melee combat. Administratum records emphasize the psychological impact of this transition. Units facing the word-bearers reported a loss of confidence in tactical predictions, as the expected progression of engagement phases no longer applied. Defensive lines designed to absorb ranged fire and transition into controlled melee were instead overwhelmed by entities that bypassed intermediate stages entirely. The sudden shift in threat profile forced commanders to adapt in real time, often without sufficient data to inform their decisions. Mechanicus studies of combat damage attributed to the Gal Vorbak further highlighted their effectiveness. Autopsy reports from recovered Imperial personnel indicated injuries consistent with both conventional Astartes weaponry and extreme physical force beyond standard parameters. Limbs were torn rather than cut, armour plating was crushed inward rather than penetrated, and in some cases, internal damage suggested exposure to energies not accounted for by known weapon systems. These findings supported the conclusion that the Gal Vorbak's offensive capabilities extended beyond physical strength into the realm of warp-mediated effects. Energy readings collected during engagements also displayed irregularities. Localized fluctuations in electromagnetic and gravitational fields were recorded in proximity to Gal Vorbak activity. While these fluctuations were not sustained at levels sufficient to disrupt large-scale operations, they contributed to sensor interference and reduced the reliability of targeting systems. Mechanicus personnel noted that these effects were most pronounced during transformation phases and close-quarters combat, suggesting a correlation between the expression of warp influence and measurable distortions in the physical environment. Administratum logistical assessments identified another critical factor in evaluating the Gal Vorbak: their apparent resilience and reduced dependence on conventional supply chains. Unlike standard Astartes units, which require ammunition, maintenance, and medical support to sustain prolonged operations, the Gal Vorbak demonstrated a capacity to remain combat effective despite significant damage and limited resupply. Reports describe individuals continuing to engage after sustaining injuries that would incapacitate or kill a standard legionary. This resilience reduced the burden on word-bearer logistics, while increasing the strain on opposing forces, which were required to expend disproportionate resources to neutralize a single target. However, this resilience was not interpreted as invulnerability. Administratum records consistently note that concentrated firepower, particularly from heavy weapons and armoured units, remained effective in neutralizing Gal Vorbak entities. The challenge lay not in their inability to be destroyed, but in the difficulty of applying sufficient force before they could close distance and inflict damage. This distinction informed revised engagement protocols, emphasizing the importance of maintaining range and prioritizing high-output weapon systems when confronting suspected Gal Vorbak units. Mechanicus' strategic findings also addressed the limitations of existing classification systems. The Gal Vorbak did not fit neatly into categories such as infantry, monstrous creature, or demonic entity. They exhibited characteristics of all three, requiring a hybrid approach to analysis and countermeasure development. This led to the recommendation that future encounters be treated as engagements with composite threats, combining elements of Astartes warfare with demonic incursion. One of the more significant conclusions drawn by administratum analysts was the implication that the Gal Vorbak represented a replicable model rather than a singular anomaly. The presence of multiple individuals exhibiting similar traits suggested that the process which created them could be repeated under the right conditions. This raised concerns regarding the potential expansion of such forces beyond the initial word-bearer formations. While early encounters involved relatively small numbers, the strategic risk lay in the possibility of scaling, where larger formations of similarly enhanced warriors could be deployed. Despite these concerns, records from this period indicate uncertainty regarding the exact mechanisms of their creation. Without direct access to word-bearer processes or reliable intelligence from within the Legion, Administratum and Mechanicus personnel were limited to observational data and post-engagement analysis. This lack of definitive understanding contributed to the classification of the Gal Vorbak as a high-priority anomaly, warranting continued study and caution in all future engagements. In summary, the combined perspective of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus frames the Gal Vorbak as a controlled deviation within the Word-Bearer's Legion, characterized by dual-layered biological signatures, integrated armour organic structures, and a tactical doctrine centered on disruption and shock assault. Their ability to transition between conventional Astartes behavior and extreme close-quarters aggression, combined with their resilience and partial resistance to standard targeting methods, positions them as a significant threat multiplier in any theatre of war. These findings, while grounded in observed data, remain incomplete. The Gal Vorbak continue to challenge established frameworks of classification and response, requiring ongoing adaptation in both analysis and battlefield strategy. Administratum resource assessments concerning the Gal Vorbak begin with a necessary clarification. They are not a self-sustaining faction in the conventional sense. They possess no independent recruitment pipeline, no distinct logistical apparatus, and no separate command infrastructure outside of the Word-Bearer's Legion. Their resources are therefore derived entirely from the Legion that created and maintains them. However, this dependency does not reduce their strategic value. It refines it. The Gal Vorbak represent a concentrated investment of rare and difficult-to-replicate assets, functioning as a specialized extension of Word-Bearer capabilities rather than a parallel force. From a resource standpoint, the most significant requirement for the creation of a Gal Vorbak is not material, but environmental and doctrinal. Mechanicus analysis identifies exposure to the Eye of Terror, or equivalent warp-saturated conditions, as a critical factor in their formation. This immediately limits scalability. Unlike standard Astartes production, which relies on gene seed cultivation, training regimens, and industrial support, the creation of a Gal Vorbak requires access to regions where the boundary between real space and the warp is sufficiently weakened to permit direct interaction with demonic entities. Such conditions cannot be replicated through conventional means, placing a natural constraint on production. In addition to environmental requirements, the process appears to demand a degree of ideological conditioning. The Word-Bearer's unique doctrinal alignment, particularly their acceptance and veneration of chaos, is identified as a prerequisite for successful integration. Administratum analysts note that other legions exposed to similar warp phenomena did not produce equivalent results, suggesting that psychological and cultural factors play a decisive role. This further restricts the potential for widespread replication, as it requires not only access to the necessary environments, but also a specific belief structure that supports and stabilizes the transformation. Material resources, while still relevant, are of secondary importance in this context. The Gal Vorbak retain and utilize standard Astartes equipment, including power armour, bolter weapons, and transport assets provided by the Wordbearer's fleet. However, their reduced reliance on external weaponry and their ability to sustain combat effectiveness despite damage lowers their logistical footprint. Ammunition consumption is less critical once engagement transitions to close quarters. Maintenance requirements for armour become less predictable due to organic integration, but also less immediately limiting, as functionality can persist despite structural compromise. Mechanicus observations highlight a paradox in this area. While the Gal Vorbak reduce demand on certain logistical channels, they introduce new uncertainties that cannot be easily managed. Armour fused with biological tissue cannot be repaired using standard methods. Damage to such systems may require intervention that blends technical and ritual processes for which the Mechanicus possesses limited reliable protocols. This creates a dependency on Wordbearer-specific practices, further isolating the Gal Vorbak from broader Imperial logistical frameworks and reinforcing their classification as a non-standard asset. In terms of faction strength, the Gal Vorbak exhibits several characteristics that elevate them above conventional Astartes units. Foremost among these is their physical resilience. Administratum combat reports consistently indicate that Gal Vorbak entities can endure levels of damage that would incapacitate or terminate standard legionaries. This resilience is not solely due to enhanced durability of tissue, but also to the presence of the warp entity within. The daemon component appears capable of sustaining function even when the host body is severely compromised, allowing the Gal Vorbak to continue operating in conditions that would otherwise result in immediate combat loss. This resilience extends to regenerative capacity. While not uniformly documented across all encounters, there are multiple instances where injuries appear to partially recover during the course of engagement. This regeneration is not comparable to the controlled healing processes of Astartes physiology, but rather manifests as rapid and irregular tissue repair, often accompanied by further mutation. From a strategic perspective, this reduces attrition rates and increases the time required to neutralize individual units, placing additional strain on opposing forces. Another significant strength lies in their adaptability. The dual consciousness structure of the Gal Vorbak allows for a combination of disciplined tactical reasoning and instinct-driven aggression. This enables them to respond dynamically to changing battlefield conditions. They can execute coordinated maneuvers when operating within a larger formation, then transition seamlessly into independent high-intensity assault roles. This flexibility complicates enemy planning, as it removes the predictability that is typically associated with Astartes engagements. Their psychological impact must also be considered a core component of their strength. Administratum reports frequently note the effect of Gal Vorbak deployments on enemy morale. The visible transformation from recognizable legionary to warp-infused entity, combined with their apparent disregard for injury and conventional limitations, creates a perception of invulnerability. This perception, whether accurate or not, contributes to breakdowns in unit cohesion and command effectiveness. In engagements where morale is a critical factor, the presence of even a small number of Gal Vorbak can produce disproportionate results. Despite these strengths, the Gal Vorbak are not without weaknesses. The most significant limitation is their dependence on the conditions that enable their creation and sustain their nature. While they can operate outside the Eye of Terror, their existence remains tied to warp influence. Administratum analysts note that in regions where warp activity is suppressed or heavily controlled, the effectiveness of warp-based phenomena can be reduced. Although there is no definitive evidence that this neutralizes the Gal Vorbak, it introduces a variable that may impact their performance. Another identified weakness is the inherent instability of their dual consciousness structure. While the original Gal Vorbak demonstrate a high degree of control, this balance is not guaranteed under all conditions. Prolonged exposure to extreme stress, psychic interference, or disruption of warp energies may exacerbate internal conflict between host and entity. In such cases, coordination could degrade, reducing their effectiveness as part of a larger operational plan. This risk is difficult to quantify, but it represents a potential vulnerability that could be exploited under controlled circumstances. Their limited numbers also constitute a strategic weakness. As previously noted, the process required to create Gal Vorbak is not easily scalable. This restricts their deployment to select engagements rather than allowing for widespread use across multiple fronts. While their impact in those engagements can be decisive, their absence elsewhere leaves gaps that must be filled by conventional forces. This imbalance limits their ability to influence the overall course of large-scale campaigns without support. From a military power perspective, the Gal Vorbak are best classified as high-value shock assets. Their effectiveness is concentrated in short-duration, high-intensity engagements where their strengths can be fully leveraged. In these scenarios, they are capable of breaking fortified positions, eliminating key targets, and creating opportunities for broader word-bearer forces to exploit. Their presence can shift the outcome of a localized battle within a relatively short time frame. However, their power is not optimized for sustained warfare. Extended engagements that require resource management, coordinated logistics, and long-term positional control are less suited to their capabilities. In such contexts, their advantages are less pronounced, and their weaknesses become more relevant. This does not render them ineffective, but it does highlight the importance of proper deployment. The word-bearers' apparent understanding of this limitation is reflected in their use of the Gal Vorbak at critical junctures rather than as a constant presence on the battlefield. Mechanicus projections suggest that the true military significance of the Gal Vorbak lies not only in their immediate combat capabilities, but in the precedent they establish. They demonstrate that it is possible to integrate warp entities into Astartes hosts in a manner that preserves functionality and enhances performance. Even if the exact process cannot be replicated easily, the concept itself represents a shift in the understanding of what constitutes a viable military asset. In conclusion, from the combined perspective of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus, the Gal Vorbak are a resource-intensive but highly effective component of the word-bearer's military structure. Their strengths in resilience, adaptability, and psychological impact are balanced by limitations in scalability, stability, and long-term deployment. Their overall military power is significant, not as a dominant force on its own, but as a multiplier that enhances the effectiveness of the legion that commands them. Administratum war logs referencing the Gal Vorbak are fragmented, often incomplete, and in several cases deliberately restricted following the earliest phases of the Horus Heresy. Despite this, a consistent pattern of appearance can be reconstructed across multiple engagements, with the earliest confirmed large-scale deployment recorded during the Istvan conflict. Prior to this, scattered reports exist of anomalous word-bearer units displaying irregular combat behaviour, but these were not formally classified at the time. It is only in retrospect, after cross-referencing survivor testimony, Mechanicus sensor data, and recovered Legion records, that these earlier instances are attributed to the presence of Gal Vorbak formations. At Istvan V, the Gal Vorbak were deployed in conjunction with the word-bearers' betrayal of loyalist forces. Administratum reconstructions indicate that their presence was not immediately identified during the opening phases of the engagement. Loyalist legions, including the Salamanders and Raven Guard, initially engaged word-bearer elements under the assumption of standard legionary doctrine. It was during the escalation of close-quarters combat that the Gal Vorbak revealed themselves, initiating transformations that disrupted established battle lines and contributed to the rapid collapse of loyalist cohesion in localized sectors. Mechanicus sensor logs from this engagement provide some of the most detailed data available. Thermal imaging recorded sudden spikes in heat output corresponding to transformation events, followed by erratic movement patterns inconsistent with standard Astartes locomotion. Kinetic impact readings from armoured units indicate force application beyond expected thresholds, with several instances of structural compromise occurring without the use of heavy weaponry. These findings support the conclusion that the Gal Vorbak's effectiveness at Istvan was not solely due to surprise, but to a measurable increase in physical capability during combat. The results of their deployment at Istvan V were significant. While the overall outcome of the battle was determined by the coordinated betrayal of multiple legions, Administratum analysts identify the Gal Vorbak as a contributing factor in accelerating the breakdown of loyalist resistance. Their ability to penetrate defensive formations and eliminate key targets reduced the time required for traitor forces to achieve dominance in contested zones. In several documented cases, command elements were neutralized within minutes of Gal Vorbak engagement, leading to disorganized retreats or complete loss of operational control. Following Istvan, references to Gal Vorbak activity appear in a range of smaller-scale engagements, often associated with word-bearer-led operations. These include compliance actions that transitioned into purges, as well as assaults on Imperial installations where resistance was expected to be moderate, but became severe due to unforeseen variables. In these contexts, the Gal Vorbak were used to resolve unexpected resistance quickly, minimizing prolonged engagement and reducing the need for extended logistical support. One such pattern observed by Administratum analysts involves the deployment of Gal Vorbak units against fortified positions. In these scenarios, standard word-bearer forces would engage in suppression and containment, drawing defensive fire and identifying structural weaknesses. The Gal Vorbak would then be introduced at a critical point, breaching defences through direct assault. Their ability to absorb damage and maintain forward momentum allowed them to close distance under conditions that would stall conventional infantry. Once inside defensive perimeters, they would target command nodes, heavy weapon emplacements, and communication systems, effectively dismantling the defensive network from within. Mechanicus records from these engagements emphasize the difficulty of tracking Gal Vorbak units once they entered close-quarters environments. Sensor interference, combined with the irregularity of their biological and energy signatures, reduced the effectiveness of automated targeting systems. This forced defending forces to rely on visual confirmation and manual targeting, increasing response time and reducing accuracy. In environments such as hive interiors or fortified installations, this disadvantage was amplified, allowing the Gal Vorbak to operate with relative freedom once initial defences were breached. Another notable aspect of their deployment is their role in engagements involving other legions. While direct cooperation between traitor legions varied in structure and effectiveness, there are indications that the Gal Vorbak were occasionally used to support operations beyond the immediate scope of the word-bearers. In these instances, their presence served both a tactical and symbolic function. Tactically, they provided a means of rapidly destabilizing enemy positions. Symbolically, they demonstrated the extent of the word-bearer's transformation, reinforcing their ideological alignment with chaos and their departure from conventional legion practices. The outcomes of these engagements consistently reflect the Gal Vorbak's role as accelerants rather than primary forces. They did not independently determine the outcome of large-scale campaigns. Instead, they influenced the tempo and direction of specific engagements within those campaigns. By reducing the time required to achieve local superiority, they enabled the word-bearers and their allies to reallocate resources more efficiently, contributing to broader strategic objectives. However, Administratum records also note limitations in their effectiveness across certain types of engagements. In open-field battles against heavily armoured formations, the advantages of the Gal Vorbak were less pronounced. While still capable of engaging armoured targets through direct assault, their lack of dedicated anti-armour weaponry reduced efficiency compared to specialised units. In such scenarios, their deployment was often delayed until armour had been neutralised or isolated, at which point their strengths in close-quarters combat could be applied more effectively. Similarly, prolonged engagements requiring sustained defensive operations did not align with their operational profile. The Gal Vorbak were not typically used to hold positions or manage extended lines of engagement. Their strengths in rapid assault and disruption did not translate as effectively into roles requiring static defense or long-term resource management. Administratum analysts interpret this as evidence of deliberate deployment strategy, rather than a deficiency in capability, indicating that the word-bearers understood and compensated for these limitations. Mechanicus' conclusions regarding the long-term implications of Gal Vorbak deployments focus on their impact on warfare paradigms. The integration of warp entities into Astartes hosts, demonstrated consistently across multiple engagements, represents a shift in the understanding of combat potential. It introduces variables that cannot be fully accounted for within existing models, requiring continuous adaptation of both analysis and response strategies. The conclusion drawn from combined Administratum and Mechanicus perspectives is that the Gal Vorbak constitute a specialized but highly effective component of the word-bearer's military operations. Their documented use across multiple engagements demonstrates a consistent pattern of deployment at critical moments, resulting in rapid disruption of enemy forces and acceleration of battle outcomes. While not without limitations, their impact on localized engagements is disproportionate to their numbers, making them a significant factor in the overall effectiveness of the forces that employ them. Their presence in these conflicts also serves as an indicator of the evolving nature of warfare during the Horus Heresy. The Gal Vorbak are not merely a tactical anomaly, they represent a broader shift toward the integration of warp phenomena into conventional military structures, a development that continues to influence the trajectory of conflict beyond the initial engagements in which they were first observed. Recovered Inquisition archive fragments, collated from Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus sources, do not treat the Gal Vorbak as a battlefield anomaly in the same sense recorded by the Adeptus Administratum or Adeptus Mechanicus. Instead, they are categorized as a threshold event, marking the point at which the integration of demonic entities into Astartes hosts transitioned from theoretical risk to confirmed repeatable occurrence. Where earlier Imperial records describe possession as instability or failure, Inquisition analysis identifies the Gal Vorbak as the first stable manifestation of a controlled union, and therefore a precedent of far greater consequence than any individual engagement. Initial impressions recorded in sealed reports emphasize the deliberate nature of their creation. It is repeatedly noted that the Gal Vorbak were not the result of accidental exposure or uncontrolled warp breach. The word-bearers actively pursued the conditions required to produce them. This distinction is central to Inquisition concern. An uncontrolled phenomenon can be contained, isolated and studied. A controlled process implies intent, refinement, and the potential for iteration. Several reports refer to this development not as corruption, but as a form of weaponization, indicating that the word-bearers did not merely succumb to chaos, but learned to apply it with purpose. Observational records compiled from interrogations of survivors and captured data slates indicate that the Gal Vorbak maintain a degree of internal cohesion that challenges standard doctrines regarding possession. Witness accounts consistently describe individuals who could speak, coordinate, and respond to command structures prior to transformation. This aligns with earlier findings but is reinterpreted by the Inquisition as evidence of layered consciousness rather than retained humanity. The distinction is subtle but significant. Inquisition scholars argue that what appears as control may in fact be a negotiated state in which the human host is no longer dominant, but functioning within parameters set by the entity it carries. This interpretation leads to a more cautious assessment of their behavior. Rather than viewing moments of discipline as evidence of stability, Inquisition reports treat them as calculated restraint. The Gal Vorbak are observed to withhold their full capabilities until tactically advantageous, suggesting a level of patience and foresight inconsistent with uncontrolled demonic influence. This behavior is considered more dangerous than overt instability, as it allows them to integrate into broader operational contexts without immediate detection. Further observations focus on the nature of their transformation. While Administratum and Mechanicus records describe the physical changes in detail, Inquisition analysis emphasizes the metaphysical implications. The transformation is not viewed merely as a change in form, but as a shift in presence. Several accounts describe a perceptible alteration in the surrounding environment at the moment of transformation, including changes in air pressure, auditory distortion, and the sensation of proximity to warp phenomena. These effects are not always measurable by instruments, but are consistently reported by individuals with prior exposure to demonic activity. From an Inquisition perspective, these observations support the conclusion that the Gal Vorbak do not simply carry warp entities within them. They act as conduits, temporarily extending the influence of the warp into real space during active engagement. This interpretation aligns with reports of localized reality distortion and reinforces concerns regarding their potential to destabilize environments beyond immediate combat zones. Conspiracy findings within Inquisition archives extend beyond direct observation into the realm of inferred intent and long-term implications. One recurring hypothesis suggests that the Gal Vorbak were not an endpoint, but an initial phase in a broader effort by the word-bearers to redefine the nature of the Astartes. According to this view, the integration of demon and marine represents a prototype for a new form of soldier, one that combines the engineered resilience of the Imperium with the adaptive and destructive potential of the warp. Supporting this hypothesis are fragmented references to continued experimentation within the Word-Bearers Legion following the initial creation of the Gal Vorbak. While concrete evidence is limited, several reports indicate that later possessed units lacked the stability and effectiveness of the original group. This is interpreted not as failure, but as evidence of an ongoing process of refinement. The Gal Vorbak are therefore seen as a baseline from which further developments may have been attempted, with varying degrees of success. Another line of inquiry focuses on the role of Lorgar in the creation and deployment of the Gal Vorbak. Inquisition records consistently identify him as a central figure, not only in authorizing the initial pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror, but in shaping the doctrinal framework that allowed such transformations to occur. Some analysts propose that the Gal Vorbak serve a dual purpose, functioning both as military assets and as proof of concept for Lorgar's theological assertions. In this interpretation, their existence is intended to demonstrate the viability of chaos as a source of power and to validate the Legion's ideological shift. There are also indications of internal selection criteria within the word-bearers regarding who could become Gal Vorbak. While details remain unconfirmed, it is believed that not all Legionaries were suitable candidates. Factors such as loyalty, psychological resilience, and doctrinal alignment are suggested as possible determinants. This implies that the process of creating a Gal Vorbak is not only dependent on external conditions, but also on the characteristics of the individual host. If accurate, this would further limit scalability while increasing the overall effectiveness of those successfully transformed. More speculative findings address the potential for the Gal Vorbak to influence or corrupt other forces beyond direct combat. Some reports suggest that prolonged exposure to their presence may increase susceptibility to warp phenomena among nearby personnel. This effect is not well documented and remains unconfirmed, but it is treated as a credible risk within certain Inquisition circles. If true, it would extend the impact of the Gal Vorbak beyond immediate physical engagement, introducing a secondary layer of threat related to contamination and ideological destabilization. There is also concern regarding the possibility of replication outside the Word-Bearers Legion. While the specific conditions that produce the Gal Vorbak are not fully understood, the existence of such entities demonstrates that the boundary between human and demon can be deliberately breached. Inquisition analysts warn that other traitor forces, or even misguided Imperial factions, could attempt to replicate this process if sufficient knowledge were obtained. This risk is compounded by the fragmented nature of available data, which prevents definitive countermeasures from being established. Despite extensive analysis, significant gaps remain in the Inquisition's understanding of the Gal Vorbak. The exact mechanisms of their creation, the limits of their stability, and the long-term consequences of their existence are all areas of ongoing investigation. This uncertainty contributes to their classification as a high-level threat, not only due to their immediate combat capabilities, but because of the broader implications they represent. In summary, the Inquisition perspective frames the Gal Vorbak as more than a specialized unit within the Word-Bearers Legion. They are identified as a controlled convergence of Astartes and demonic entities, achieved through deliberate action and sustained by ideological commitment. Their ability to maintain operational coherence while exhibiting warp-based capabilities positions them as a uniquely dangerous development, one that challenges existing doctrines of both warfare and containment. The observations and conspiracy findings surrounding the Gal Vorbak do not converge on a single definitive conclusion. Instead, they outline a range of possibilities, each of which carries significant risk. Whether viewed as a prototype, a weapon, or a manifestation of a deeper transformation within the word-bearers, the Gal Vorbak represent a shift in the nature of conflict that cannot be ignored or easily countered. Interrogative material attributed to the Order Malleus and Order Hereticus provides a narrower but more revealing view of the Gal Vorbak than battlefield observation alone. These findings are derived from a limited number of sources, including survivor debriefings, sanctioned psycho impressions, and in rare instances captured or partially restrained subjects. The reliability of each source varies, and many records are marked with cautionary annotations. Despite this, several consistent patterns emerge, particularly in relation to the internal structure of the Gal Vorbak and the anomalies associated with their existence. Interrogations of survivors who engaged Gal Vorbak units at close range frequently describe a phenomenon of divided perception. Subjects report that the entities appeared to occupy more space than their physical form allowed, or that their movement could not be tracked in a continuous sequence. In several accounts, witnesses describe observing a Gal Vorbak in two positions simultaneously, only for the image to resolve into a single form upon direct engagement. While these reports cannot be fully verified through conventional means, they align with known warp distortion effects and are therefore considered credible within Inquisition analysis. More controlled interrogations involving sanctioned psychers provide additional insight. In cases where psychers were exposed to the presence of a Gal Vorbak, even at a distance, they reported difficulty isolating a singular psychic signature. Instead, they described overlapping presences, each distinct yet inseparable. Attempts to focus on one presence often resulted in intrusion from the other, creating a feedback effect that disrupted concentration and, in some cases, caused physical distress. This supports the conclusion that the Gal Vorbak do not present as a single entity within the warp, but as a composite presence that resists conventional classification. In the rare instances where communication with a Gal Vorbak was attempted, either directly or through psychic mediation, the results were inconsistent. Some reports indicate that the Astartes component was capable of responding to interrogation, providing coherent answers, and demonstrating awareness of its condition. In these cases, the tone and content of responses suggest a degree of acceptance rather than resistance. The subject did not deny the presence of the entity within, nor did it express a desire for separation. Instead, it described the union as necessary or inevitable, often framing it within the doctrinal beliefs of the word-bearers. Other attempts yielded markedly different results. In these cases, the entity within the Gal Vorbak appeared to dominate the exchange, either overriding the host's responses or speaking independently. The language used in such instances is frequently described as fragmented, metaphorical, or inconsistent with human communication patterns. In several records, the entity's responses included references to concepts or perceptions that could not be translated into coherent Imperial terms. These interactions were typically terminated due to the risk posed to interrogators, particularly psychers, who reported increased levels of mental strain and, in some cases, lasting psychological damage. Anomalies associated with the Gal Vorbak extend beyond communication and perception into measurable physical effects. Inquisition field reports document localized disturbances in proximity to active Gal Vorbak units, including fluctuations in temperature, pressure, and electromagnetic activity. While these disturbances are not always consistent, they are sufficiently frequent to be considered a characteristic feature. In some engagements, these effects intensified during transformation phases, suggesting a direct correlation between the expression of the daemon component and the degree of environmental disruption. One of the more concerning anomalies involves the apparent resistance of Gal Vorbak entities to conventional containment methods. In attempts to restrain or isolate captured subjects, Standard stasis fields and nullification protocols produced mixed results. In certain cases, the Astartes body could be immobilized, but the warp presence remained active, manifesting through auditory or psychic phenomena. In other instances, containment systems experienced degradation or interference, leading to partial or complete failure. These outcomes have led to the classification of Gal Vorbak containment as a high-risk operation requiring specialized measures beyond standard procedures. Documented encounters compiled by the Inquisition further illustrate the variability and danger of Gal Vorbak engagements. One recurring pattern involves their use in targeted strikes against key personnel. In several cases, commanders, astropaths, and other high-value individuals were eliminated within moments of Gal Vorbak contact, often before defensive measures could be fully enacted. The speed and precision of these attacks indicate a level of situational awareness that extends beyond simple aggression, reinforcing the assessment that the Gal Vorbak retain or develop advanced tactical cognition. Encounters involving Imperial forces unprepared for their presence tend to result in disproportionate casualties. Units that initially classify the Gal Vorbak as standard Astartes often fail to adjust their tactics in time to counter the shift in threat profile. This delay allows the Gal Vorbak to close distance and engage in conditions that favour their strengths. Subsequent reports from surviving units frequently emphasise the importance of immediate recognition and adaptation, though such recognition is not always possible given the Gal Vorbak's ability to conceal their true nature prior to transformation. There are also records of encounters where Imperial forces achieved limited success against Gal Vorbak units through the application of specialized tactics. Concentrated heavy weapon fire, coordinated use of psychers, and deployment of anti-demonic assets have been shown to reduce their effectiveness. However, these measures require preparation and resources that are not always available in standard engagements. As a result, such successes are relatively rare and often come at significant cost. Inquisition analysis also considers the possibility of indirect effects resulting from Gal Vorbak encounters. Some reports suggest that exposure to their presence may influence the psychological state of nearby personnel, increasing susceptibility to fear, confusion, or, in extreme cases, warp-related phenomena. While these effects are not universally observed, their potential impact on unit cohesion and operational effectiveness is significant enough to warrant continued investigation. A particularly notable case involves a recorded encounter where a Gal Vorbak entity was subjected to sustained psychic assault by multiple sanctioned psychers. During this engagement, observers reported a temporary destabilization of the entity's form, with visible fluctuations between its Astartes and transformed states. This suggests that the balance between host and daemon can be disrupted under specific conditions, though the practical application of this finding remains limited due to the resources required and the risks involved. In summary, Inquisition interrogative findings and documented encounters present the Gal Vorbak as entities defined by duality, instability, and resistance to conventional methods of analysis and containment. Their anomalies, both physical and metaphysical, challenge existing frameworks and require a multidisciplinary approach to understanding and countering their presence. The evidence gathered through these investigations reinforces the classification of the Gal Vorbak as a high-priority threat, not only due to their combat capabilities, but because of the broader implications of their existence. They demonstrate that the integration of warp entities into human hosts can produce stable, functional, and highly effective combatants, a reality that continues to influence Inquisition strategy and doctrine. Sealed Inquisition archives concerning the Gal Vorbak are marked with layered restrictions, often requiring authorization from multiple ordos before partial access is granted. The classification level assigned to these records does not stem solely from the danger posed by the entities themselves, but from the implications their existence carries for Imperial doctrine. The Gal Vorbak are not recorded as isolated aberrations. They are preserved within Inquisition files as proof that the boundaries between sanctioned biology and the warp can be deliberately breached and stabilized under specific conditions. This alone elevates them from battlefield threat to doctrinal crisis. Classified summaries repeatedly emphasize a singular conclusion. The Gal Vorbak represent the first confirmed instance of controlled, repeatable possession within Astartes-grade hosts. While earlier records across Imperial history contain references to possession, these are consistently associated with instability, rapid degeneration, or immediate termination of the host. The Gal Vorbak contradict this pattern. They demonstrate that under the correct convergence of environment, ideology, and subject selection, a host can endure the presence of a warp entity without immediate loss of function. This conclusion is treated with extreme caution, as it introduces a precedent that cannot be easily contained within existing frameworks. Several classified files reference attempts to model the process that produced the Gal Vorbak, though none provide a complete reconstruction. Fragments suggest that the Wordbearer's pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror was not merely exploratory, but structured. It is believed that specific individuals were selected based on criteria that remain partially understood. These criteria likely included psychological conditioning, doctrinal alignment, and a capacity to withstand prolonged exposure to warp influence. However, the exact thresholds and variables remain unconfirmed. Inquisition analysts note that even partial replication of such conditions would carry unacceptable risk, leading to a standing directive that no sanctioned experimentation of this nature is to be conducted within Imperial jurisdiction. Additional files detail internal debates within the Inquisition regarding the classification of the Gal Vorbak. One faction argues that they should be treated as demonic entities inhabiting Astartes' remains, effectively removing the human component from consideration. Another position maintains that the host remains an active participant, and that the Gal Vorbak should therefore be classified as hybrid beings requiring a distinct category. This debate is not resolved within the archives. Instead, both interpretations are retained, with operational protocols designed to address the threat under either assumption. This lack of consensus reflects the broader difficulty in defining entities that do not conform to established categories. Of particular concern within classified records is the potential for knowledge transfer. The existence of the Gal Vorbak implies that the process of controlled possession is not only possible, but has already been achieved by a traitor legion. The risk that elements of this knowledge could spread beyond the word-bearers is treated as a high-level threat. Several files reference intercepted communications and recovered texts that suggest attempts by other Chaos-aligned forces to replicate or adapt the process. While these attempts are often described as less stable or effective, their mere existence reinforces the urgency of containment and suppression. There are also indications that the Gal Vorbak themselves may serve as vectors of information, either intentionally or inadvertently. Inquisition reports note that encounters with these entities sometimes involve the transmission of concepts or impressions that extend beyond direct communication. This is most frequently observed in psychers, who report residual thoughts or images following exposure. While the reliability of these accounts is variable, they are treated as credible enough to warrant inclusion in classified threat assessments. If accurate, this would suggest that the Gal Vorbak are not only combatants, but carriers of ideological and metaphysical influence. Certain classified encounters describe attempts to isolate and study individual Gal Vorbak units under controlled conditions. These operations are rare and often terminated prematurely due to containment failure or unacceptable risk escalation. In the limited data recovered from such attempts, there are references to fluctuations in the entity's coherence when subjected to sustained nullification fields or psychic pressure. In some cases, the host and the warp entity appeared to diverge temporarily, resulting in instability that could be exploited. However, these conditions were difficult to maintain and often led to unpredictable outcomes, including violent escalation or complete system failure. Speculative entries within the archives address the long-term implications of Gal Vorbak-type entities. One line of analysis suggests that they represent an early stage in a broader evolutionary trajectory, where the integration of warp entities into physical hosts becomes more refined and widespread. Another interpretation frames them as a transitional form, inherently unstable and unlikely to persist without constant reinforcement from warp influence. Both perspectives are supported by partial evidence, and neither can be conclusively validated. The absence of definitive data ensures that both possibilities remain under consideration. There are also classified discussions regarding the potential countermeasures against Gal Vorbak entities. While no single method is identified as universally effective, a combination of approaches is recommended. These include the use of null fields to disrupt warp influence, concentrated heavy weapon fire to overcome physical resilience, and coordinated psychic assault to destabilize the internal balance between host and entity. Each of these methods carries its own risks and limitations, and their effectiveness varies depending on the specific characteristics of the target. As such, they are treated as situational tools rather than standardized solutions. The conclusion drawn from these classified files is consistent across multiple ordos, despite differences in interpretation and emphasis. The Gal Vorbak are to be considered a persistent and evolving threat, not because of their numbers, but because of what they represent. They demonstrate that the integration of warp entities into human hosts can be achieved with a degree of control sufficient for sustained military application. This realization alters the strategic landscape, introducing the possibility of similar developments emerging in other contexts. From an Inquisition perspective, the primary objective is not only to counter the Gal Vorbak in active engagements, but to prevent the conditions that allow their creation from being reproduced. This includes the suppression of knowledge related to their origin, the monitoring of environments with high warp activity, and the identification of ideological movements that mirror the doctrinal path taken by the word-bearers. The threat is therefore both physical and conceptual, requiring a response that extends beyond the battlefield. In final assessment, the Gal Vorbak are classified not merely as possessed Astartes, but as a convergence point between two fundamentally incompatible domains. They embody the successful fusion of engineered humanity and demonic presence, a state that challenges the foundational assumptions of Imperial science, theology, and warfare. Their continued existence serves as a reminder that the barriers separating these domains are not absolute, and that under certain conditions they can be deliberately crossed. This conclusion does not provide resolution. It establishes a boundary of understanding, beyond which current knowledge cannot reliably extend. The Gal Vorbak remain within that boundary, fully observed yet not fully explained, contained in record but not in implication.